By the time Favour realized they were going to sell her, the room had already decided she belonged to somebody else. And somewhere beyond the door, men were casually discussing how much money she worth. Nobody knew where she was. Nobody was coming for her. At least, that's what she believed. Because across Seoul, a man she'd met only once was tearing the city apart trying to find her. She didn't know he was feared, and the entire districts lowered their voices when speaking about him. And now the most dangerous man in Seoul was coming for the girl who donated her blood for him to live. That was supposed to be the end of her story. But life doesn't end in moments like that. It resets, quietly. Favour arrived at the bakery by 4 a.m. The street was still quiet when she came around the corner, just the low hum of a distant bus, the convenience store light across the road, the ordinary stillness of a city between one day and the next. She almost didn't see him. He was sitting against the front of the shop beside the door, back against the wall, one knee raised, one hand pressed flat to his side. His jacket was dark enough that she might have mistaken him for Shadow if she hadn't looked directly. She stopped. He looked up at her, eyes sharp, face controlled in a way that didn't match the blood spreading beneath his hand. "Don't call anyone," he said. She crouched in front of him, looked at his side. 1 second of assessment. "I'm not calling anyone," she said. "Can you stand?" He said yes. He couldn't, not without her shoulder under his arm, but he tried, and between the two of them they moved. She didn't take him through the main hospital entrance. She knew the side door, the one that emptied into the supply corridor, because she had walked past this building enough times to notice things most people didn't. The attending physician came out of the room 20 minutes later looking pale.
The patient lost a lot of blood and needs blood.
Oh, God.
He'd lost too much blood. Critical volume. And his blood type, rare enough that their current supply had nothing matching. The doctor looked at her. She was the only one there. "Check mine," Favour said. They did. It matched. She sat in the corridor afterwards with a cup of orange juice she didn't remember anyone handing her. Her head was light. She waited until the doctor came back out and told her the patient was stable.
"He's stable now."
Then she stood up, gathered her bag, and walked out. She didn't leave her name. She didn't look into the room. She went back to the bakery, unlocked the door, and started making bread. Because the city was waking up and the shelves needed to be stocked, and that was what the morning required. She did not think of it as remarkable. She had simply been the person standing there. Sincho's real name was Yichai. Nobody still dared to call him that. The name Sincho came from the district where he grew up, a part of Seoul where power mattered more than law and survival taught lessons faster. He inherited his father's organization at 26 after certain men decided they preferred him dead during the transition. But they failed. 6 years later, Sincho had become the kind of man people lowered their voices for. His men stayed loyal for one reason above all others. Sincho never abandoned his own people to save himself. Now a woman he'd met once, who had quietly donated blood and disappeared back into her ordinary life before dawn, had left behind something he could not ignore, a debt. And Sincho believed debts changed the structure of the world until they were repaid. "Who found me?" Sincho said. His voice was rougher than usual, but his mind was already moving and assessing. Do-yeon hesitated. "We don't know yet. The staff said a woman brought you in. Young. She told them you'd been in an accident." He paused. "She gave blood, matched your type. They said if she hadn't..." Another pause. "She left before we could speak to her." Sincho was quiet for a moment. "Find her," he said. It took his people 3 days. They found her because of the bakery. The cardigan she'd left in the alley had Mrs. O's shop name embroidered on the collar in faded thread. Small detail. They had a file on her within 4 hours. Favour Charles, 23, African. Resident visa, 2 years in Sincho district. No family in the country, no criminal record, no significant connections. Sincho read the file twice. There was a surveillance photo taken from across the street, Favour stepping out of the bakery at 5 in the morning to carry in a flour sack, her hair tied up, her face relaxed. She looked. He didn't have the right word for it. He had almost died. Been in situations where the probability of his survival had narrowed. The physician had told Do-yeon afterwards that another 20 minutes and the blood loss alone would have been unsurvivable. The woman had made a decision to act in the space of seconds, in the dark, for a man whose name she didn't know. He was not a man who experienced debt the way most people did, as an obligation to be discharged and forgotten. He experienced it as something structural, an imbalance in the structure, things that needed to be corrected. He was still thinking about the file when Do-yeon's call came in, the call that changed everything. "She's been flagged at the Hanam auction." The words landed in Sincho's chest like something physical. He was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Her stepmother filed the listing, Do-yeon said. She sold the debt. Favour's debt manufactured. Documents, fabricated arrears, false loan agreements. The listing went live this morning. Auction is set for tomorrow night. Hanam Auction was not a place where people sold commodities, stolen goods, or black market pharmaceuticals, although of those also happened there. It was a place where certain men with money paid for a specific category of human being who had been carefully stripped of all official protection, all legal recourse, all family claim. Sincho stood up from his desk. The car, let's move immediately. Favour had been in the back room. She has been taken at the end of her shift, which she thought later was a detail that was almost funny. She'd been locking up the display case, pastries wrapped for morning, everything in its place. And then there were 2 men in the doorway and a voice on the phone she hadn't heard in 2 years telling her calmly that her visa irregularities had been reported, and she needed to come with them immediately. She hadn't thought she experienced most things, and understood even then that fighting 2 men in a closed bakery at 10 at night was not a plan that would end in her advantage. They'd taken her phone, given her nothing to eat. The room was cold. She sat against the wall and did what she'd always done when things became unbearable. She stayed very still and she thought about small things. She did not think about Glory, about what had been done or what it had cost her stepmother nothing to do. She has already spent most of her life refusing to let that woman take up space in her head, and she was not going to give her that now. The sounds from the other room built gradually over the evening. Voices, movement, the specific controlled noise of a gathering being organized. She understood without being told what was happening. She pressed her back against the cold wall and breathed. The explosion of the door happened at 11:47. And then there were men moving through the room with a particular quality of purposeful, controlled motion that was different from anything Favour had seen before. The sounds from the other room changed entirely, then mostly stopped. Then the door to the back room opened. The man who stepped through it was tall, dark jacket, a small bandage still visible at the side of his neck from what she didn't yet know was 4 days ago. His face was, she searched for a word, still. He looked at her the way someone looks at something they've been looking for. Then he said, "Can you walk?" Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Yes." He stepped aside to let her through first. They took her to a building she didn't know, in a car she didn't recognize, with 3 men who didn't speak to her but whose body language made it clear that they were, inexplicably, arranging themselves around her in a way that suggested protection rather than restraint. The office she was brought to was large and quietly furnished, bookshelves, a desk, a window that looked out over Seoul at night. She sat in the chair. Sincho came in 5 minutes later, poured 2 glasses of water without, set one in front of her and sat across the desk. He looked at her. "Hanam Street Hospital," he said. 4 days ago, Tuesday night." She said nothing. "You carried me 4 blocks. Also saved my life by donating your blood. You left before they could tell you whether I survived. I'm told you didn't leave your name." "I didn't know your name either," she said. Something crossed his face. "I know who you are," he said. "What was done to you and by whom?" He set a document on the desk, turned it to face her. "This is a contract. We're rare blood type, rarer than you probably know. Like you see, my world is a dangerous place, so I need my rare blood type donor close. I'm offering you compensation, secure housing, full legal documentation of your residency status and protection." He paused. "In exchange, you remain available as a donor as needed, and you remain in this building or in its adjacent properties." She looked at the document, then at him. "This is so you can keep me here," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "Yes," he said, straightforwardly. She looked at the contract for a long moment. "If I sign this," she said slowly, "what happens to Glory?" He held her gaze. "That's already being handled." She picked up the pen. He gave her a room that was larger than any room she'd ever occupied, which she slowly made smaller by gravitating to one corner of it. The chair near the window, the small table where she'd asked for and received baking supplies, the single shelf she'd arranged with the few things she'd been allowed to retrieve from the bakery apartment. Mrs. O had wept when Favour had come to collect her things. Favour had held the old woman's hands and told her she was fine and that she'd visit when she can, and walked out without looking back because that was the only way she knew how to leave things, looking forward, moving. The first time she made bread in that building, the kitchen staff looked at her with open confusion. The second time, 2 of them asked if they could learn. The third time, Sincho came to stand in the kitchen doorway, and then, without a word, sat at the counter and accepted the role she set in front of him without looking up from her work. He came back the next morning, and the one after that. The corridor outside the kitchen was quieter than usual that night. Favour noticed it immediately. One of the men stationed near the stairwell straightened slightly when she walked past. Another avoided looking directly at her altogether. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door shut heavily. She slowed near the kitchen entrance, then stopped. Sincho was standing at the sink with his sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, washing blood from his hands. Darkened water curled briefly around his fingers before disappearing down the drain. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. He looked up first. And in that exact moment, she saw it, the split between the man who sat quietly at her counter eating warm bread in the mornings. The man the city feared enough to whisper about. Something inside her shifted unexpectedly. Something sadder. Sincho watched her carefully, his hands stilled under the water. "I told them not to let you come through this hallway tonight," he said quietly. Favour realized then that the silence in the building wasn't accidental. It had been arranged for her. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice sounded smaller than she wanted it to. He reached for a towel slowly, eyes never leaving her face. "You shouldn't have seen this." Problem was she didn't know which part he meant, the blood or him. A man shouted somewhere far downstairs, then silence again. Sincho folded the towel once precisely. "I handled it," he said, and that was somehow worse. Favour nodded once, then walked into the kitchen without another word. The next morning she did not wait for him. Usually by the time he entered, there would already be tea set aside near the counter, simply expected. This morning there was nothing there. The absence landed immediately. Sincho stood near the doorway a second longer than usual. The kitchen staff noticed. No one said anything. Favour kept kneading dough without looking up. Too much flour on the counter. Movement slightly too fast, not angry, trying to become unreadable. Sincho watched her hands. "Did you sleep?" he asked finally. Yes, a lie, both of them knew it. He stepped closer, not enough to corner her, just enough to lower his voice. "Favour." Something in the way he said her name nearly broke her composure. She focused harder on the dough. "You don't have to explain your world to me," she said softly. "I understand what it is." His jaw tightened slightly. "That is what this is." "Then what is it?" The question came out before she could stop it. For the first time since entering this building, she looked at him like she wasn't entirely certain where she belonged inside his life. Sincho saw it instantly, and it hit him with surprising force. He had spent years surviving betrayal, negotiation, violence, pressure. None of it felt remotely like this. He moved closer carefully. "There are things I can do," he said quietly, "because they happen away from you." A pause. "But the moment they touch you," his voice lowered further, "I start wanting things I shouldn't." Favour finally looked at him then. And there it was again. That terrifying softness in a dangerous man. Fear that she would pull away from him. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then the oven timer rang. The sound shattered the moment just enough for her to breathe again. She turned away too quickly, reached for the tray. And Sincho, understanding instinctively that if he pushed further now, she would retreat completely, stepped back instead. But he did not leave the kitchen. And for the rest of the morning, neither of them strayed very far from the other. He said once to her, "Your baking are super yummy, I can't seem to get enough." They both laugh. Then she said, "You're always free to eat as many as you want. Mafia king." He smiled softly, looking at her. Not once in his life had he ever paid so much attention to any woman, but somehow he was doing that now. She noticed things about him and pretended not to notice. It was safer, she told herself, to pretend. The first time she saw him work, she was walking through the corridor toward the kitchen, and a door that was usually closed was open. There were 4 men inside, none of them his. From the quality of the room's atmosphere, the particular tension of people trying very hard to appear unbothered, she understood they had made some kind of mistake or done something they should not have done. Sincho's back was to the door. She couldn't hear what he said, only that he spoke quietly, without, like someone who has never found it necessary to raise their voice. One of the 4 men's composure disintegrated midway through whatever was being said. He did not shout. He sat down heavily in his chair. She moved before anyone saw her. At dinner that evening, she set an extra portion on the tray that was sent to his office. An hour later, Do-yeon came to find her with the empty tray. "He wants to know who sent this," Do-yeon said, with an expression that suggested the asking had been the most confusing order he'd received in recent memory. "Tell him the kitchen," Favour said. Do-yeon paused. "He knows it wasn't the kitchen." She looked at him. Then he already has his answer. She went back to her book. 3 weeks in, a man she hadn't seen before appeared in the building, Ri-jun, she later learned, whose organization shared certain operational lines with Sincho's. Ri-jun was handsome. He found her in the garden. She'd started going there in the mornings because the kitchen windows didn't open and she needed air, and sat beside her without being invited and introduced himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no by a woman he'd decided to speak to. "The blood girl," he said, which she found immediately and thoroughly unpleasant. "My name is Favour," she said. He smiled. "Favour, what a word." He leaned slightly closer. "You know you don't have to stay here. Whatever contract he's put you under, I can." "I know I don't have to stay," she said clearly. "I chose to." He blinked. She went back inside. She mentioned none of it to Sincho. But that evening at the dinner, her at the kitchen table, him at the counter, some negotiated middle ground between his office and formality, he set down his chopsticks and said, "Ri-jun spoke to you this morning." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "What did he say?" "He implied I was a captive and offered to help me leave." A pause. Sincho's jotted something she was learning to read, a very slight tightening. "What did you say?" "That I chose to be here." He was quiet for a moment. When he looked up at her, there was something in it. "Do you," he said, "choose to be here?" She met his eyes. "Yes." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his chopsticks. But his shoulders, she noticed, had come down from wherever they'd been. The first time he did something that she understood as protection was the night Glory arrived. She didn't know Glory had found her until Do-yeon knocked on her room door at 10 at night and said, with studied neutrality, that there was a woman at the building's main gate claiming to be her family. Favour went still. "She says she wants to apologize," Do-yeon added. "She's asking to come in." "She can't come in," Sincho said from somewhere behind her. She turned. He'd come out of the office across the corridor, still in his working clothes, a document in his hand he'd clearly been reading. "She's asking to speak to her," Do-yeon said carefully. "I heard what she's asking." He looked at Favour. "What do you want?" The question landed strangely. She realized with a jolt that ran somewhere deep that it had been a long time since anyone had asked her that. "What do you want?" "I don't want to see her," Favour said. Sincho nodded, looked at Do-yeon. "She doesn't come in, she doesn't come back, make that clear." Do-yeon left. Sincho looked at Favour for one more moment. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. Then, because he deserved the truth more than the performance, "No, not entirely." He nodded again, as if that was exactly the right answer. He went back into his office but left the door open. She didn't know why, couldn't explain why it mattered, only that it did. She sat in the kitchen for an hour. At some point, he came and set a cup of tea on the table beside her, then sat across from her in the silence. She didn't say thank you. She didn't know how to say thank you for something this large in a way that wouldn't collapse under the weight of what it meant. She thought he understood. The weeks that followed taught her the geography of his life in fragments. She learned it from the small things. What the quiet before a bad night felt like. Once, she watched one of the younger men drop an entire tray of documents across the office floor. Nobody moved. The room tightened instantly. Sincho crouched and helped gather the papers. Told him to breathe before speaking again. Later that same night, she heard he'd broken another man's hand for lying to him twice. She started saving the softer piece of bread for morning. She knew he didn't sleep. She was simply learning him, carefully, because somehow he matters to her. The rivalry with Ri-jun sharpened gradually through the spring. It had always been there. His men explained this to her in careful fragments, the ones who had decided she could be trusted, which happened when the realization spread through the building that Sincho moved differently when she was in the room. And in a world where that man's emotional state was whether something you read carefully and adjusted to, the fact of it mattered. Ri-jun wanted a larger piece of the district's financial infrastructure. Sincho had declined the expansion. Ri-jun had smiled and said he understood. He didn't understand. What followed was a series of pressures, operational, financial, reputational, that Sincho absorbed and managed without visible strain, which was its own kind of message. But one evening, returning from a meeting she hadn't been part of, Do-yeon told her quietly that Ri-jun's people had made an approach to two of their mid-level men, an attempt at fracture. She found Sincho in the office that night, later than she normally would have knocked. He looked up. "I heard about the approach," she said. "You don't need to worry about it." "I'm not worried," she said. "I'm telling you I know." After a moment, he leaned back in his chair. "Sit down," he said. She did. And for the first time, he talked to her not as someone he was managing or protecting, but as someone whose judgment he was, tentatively, consulting. He laid out the situation plainly. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He's not trying to take the district," she said. "He's trying to make you react. He wants you angry enough to move first so that you're the one who violates the agreement." Sincho looked at her. "He's been doing it with me too," she said. "The morning in the garden, he wanted you to hear about it. He wanted to know if you'd react." A long silence. "And did I?" he said carefully. "You asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what you'd decided," she said. "So no." His expression shifted in a way she was beginning to catalog. "You're very perceptive," he said, and the way he said it made it land somewhere different to a compliment. "I've had a lot of practice," she said. "Going unnoticed teaches you to notice." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not going unnoticed," he said. She stood. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Favour." She walked out with her heart doing something she refused, for the moment, to examine. The attack came in, at the building's east, during what should have been a routine transfer. She heard it from the kitchen, a sound like the world deciding to be louder than agreed. And then she was moving, because the first rule she'd learned about emergencies in this building was move toward the interior stairwell, which she did. And then there were two of Sincho's men on either side of her moving her down and away, and she went, because she trusted the architecture. But on the second landing, through the window, she saw him. Sincho was in the east courtyard. He'd been caught in the open during the initial breach. She understood this later, in pieces, and the men with him had been separated. There were 3 of Ri-jun's people between him and the door. She could see this from the window. Her guard's attention was on the lower level. She moved before she decided to. She came around the corner into the courtyard from the service entrance at the same moment as the shot, meant for Sincho, angled toward his back as he turned. And she was between them because she had moved toward him without thinking, without calculating, the same instinct that had crouched beside him in outside her bakery shop 8 months ago. The bullet caught her in the shoulder. She went down. The world became very simple for a moment, pain, concrete, the sound of everything around her becoming very loud and then muffled. She heard Sincho's voice, which was different from any sound she had ever heard him make, raw and urgent. Then he quickly outsmart the men and put bullets in them. His hands were on her face. "Favour," his voice was shaking. "Look at me, look at me." She did. She was trying to say something about how shoulder wounds were survivable and that she was fine. How he should check that the courtyard was clear before crouching in the open like this. But what came out was, "I saw it coming." "I know," he said, something terrible in those 2 words. "I know." He picked her up himself, didn't wait for anyone. She felt him moving through the building with her and the particular controlled fury in his body, and she thought, distantly. This is what it feels like when someone is afraid for you. She had never been inside that feeling from this direction. It was enormous. She woke in the building's medical room with her shoulder bandaged, and an IV in her arm and Sincho in the chair beside her. Awake, still in his blood-marked clothes from the night before, his elbows on his knees, his hands folded, his eyes on her face. He hadn't moved all night. She could see it in him. She looked at him in the pale morning light. "You should sleep," she said. He said nothing for a moment. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was controlling something. But his eyes, looking at her, she had never seen his eyes like that. "You stepped in front of it," he said. "Yes." "You stepped in front of," he stopped, started again. "You could have." "I know." "Why?" His voice was quiet, careful, as if the question was costing him something to ask. She looked at the ceiling, then at him. "Because it's what you do," she said simply, "when someone matters." He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached out and took her hand, slowly, as if asking a question, and held it. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, and then he just held on, and she let him, and neither of them said anything. Inside the room, something had changed that could not be unchanged. The weeks
I
of her
thought this might
recovery
brighten the room a little.
It's lovely. I'm just glad you're here with me.
were the quietest weeks either of them had known in a long time. He came every morning, not always with a reason. Sometimes with documents he needed to work through, sometimes with food she hadn't asked for, once with a small potted plant he set on the windowsill without explanation, which she was fairly certain Do-yeon had been dispatched to buy and which sat there, green and unremarkable, accumulating meaning. He told her things, about the building at 26 and his father's partners and the 6 years since, about what he'd built and why, also the parts of it he'd made peace with and the parts he hadn't. She told him things, too, about her father and the quiet kindnesses that hadn't been enough, the bus ticket and 11 days of money, Mrs. O's shop and the stray cat and the bread she made at 4 in the morning to feel like the day had structure. He listened the way he did everything else, completely, without distraction. "You've been protecting people your whole life," he said once, "and no one has protected you." It wasn't a revelation, she knew it, but it landed differently said by someone else, out loud by him. "Until now," he said. She looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching, which was, she was learning, its own kind of declaration. Sincho did not say things he did not mean. He did not make promises he wasn't already in the process of keeping. "Until now," she agreed quietly. June's response to the failed attack was swift and poorly conceived. He made approaches to 3 of the district's other powers simultaneously, attempting to build a coalition behind Sincho's back, and the structure of it came apart within a week, because you do not build coalitions against Sincho by being sloppy about it. When the accounting came, Sincho handled it himself. Favour didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. What she needed, she asked for, quietly, one evening, was for him to come back to the kitchen when it was done. He did. He sat at the counter, and she set bread and tea in front of him, and they sat together in the kitchen's particular warmth for an hour without speaking much. "It's over," he said. "Good," she said. He looked at her hands, wrapped around her cup. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because of the donor contract." He found her eyes. "I want you to stay." She held his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He breathed a long, slow breath and nodded. What came after was not without its complications. There were other pressures, other nights, other tests of the architecture he'd built and what she meant within it. She sat in on certain conversations, offered the particular observations she'd spent her life cultivating, and was listened to with the completeness she had never in her life been offered.
Okay,
She brought
little
the
one,
stray
go
cat from the
explore.
bakery's back step.
Look at him go.
He's so curious.
Be careful, tiny friend.
He didn't say anything about it. It appeared to have a bed within 3 days. She started teaching baking to 2 of the kitchen staff who'd asked, and then somehow to 4, and then the building began to smell, in the mornings, like the bakery she'd left, warm and flowery and specific, a smell that anchored mornings, that made the building feel less like a headquarters and more like a place where people lived. Mrs. O came for dinner once a month. She always cried a little and always denied it. On a weekend in the autumn of the following year,
You are my today and all of my tomorrows. I pledge to you my heart, my life, and my love forever.
in a small ceremony attended by the people who mattered and no one who didn't, Favour wore a dress the color of winter light, and Sincho wore something dark and simple, and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the first his eye met hers, like he was trying to understand something and finding, slowly, that he was. The photograph in the top drawer of the desk, Favour learned that afternoon, was his parents'. She held it carefully and he stood beside her and told her their names. They would have, he stopped, then quietly, they would have liked you. She held the photograph a moment longer. Tell me about them, she said. He did. Favour gave birth to twins which arrived on a cold morning 18 months later, a boy and a girl, small, furious, and perfect. Sincho held his son for the first time with the specific terror of a man who has survived significant things and is now encountering something he cannot control by being precise. Favour watched his face. She watched him look down at his daughter, at her small closed fist, her frown, the undecided color of her eyes, and watched the thing that moved through him, slow and overwhelming, dismantling the last architecture of distance. He looked up. His eyes were bright. She smiled at him. He came and sat beside her on the bed, still holding the boy, and pressed his forehead against hers for a long moment, and she put her hand against the back of his neck, and they stayed like that, all four of them in the quiet room, soul moving outside the window, the world continuing as it does, and she thought. This is it. This is what it was all for. Not the violence, the contract, the auction room or the hospital corridor or the bullet or the years before any of it. All of that was the distance and road. This story is written and directed by secret Mafia love. If you felt Favour's quiet strength and Sincho's slow unraveling, then you already know what this channel is about. Every story here is for you. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.